Hello and welcome to the seventh and final week of our Adult Small Groups Bible Study. Today, this gospel passage that we just heard, it breaks with the passages that we've been hearing for the last 6 weeks. And that's because we're beginning a new liturgical year with this season of Advent. Advent, which means the arrival or coming. And we begin to hear not from Matthew, but hear from the gospel according to Mark. And in these next 3 weeks of Advent following this, we're going to skip around the Gospels a little bit. But we're going to hear from all these different places, but they all tell of someone who is coming. In this passage, Jesus telling us to be alert. In John the Baptist, twice we hear of him proclaiming the coming of one who is to come. And then in the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel telling Mary of Jesus' coming again. But this passage from Mark that we've heard today, it comes from a similar part of Matthew's Gospel that we have heard these last 6 weeks. That's because this also comes from the end of the end of Mark's Gospel. In chapter 12, so the chapter before this passage, we heard about paying taxes to the emperor, the greatest commandment, the denunciation of the scribes, all familiar things that we were hearing from Matthew's Gospel. But here in chapter 13, Jesus tells of the coming destruction of the temple, and then he moves to the Mount of Olives opposite the temple for this passage here to tell of the signs of the end, before here talking about our need for watchfulness, our own need to stay awake, to be alert. And here we note that the Lord has come to his temple one final time in Jerusalem, but there he found his leaders to be corrupt and to be hard-hearted, so he leaves it for the last time before his passion and death, leading up to this passage here. And so before this passage, he was talking about the fall of Jerusalem, which he said would happen within 1 generation's time. And indeed, the temple was destroyed about 40 years later in about 70 AD. But now he talks about the end of history, and he tells us that no one's going to know the day, no one is going to know the hour of that end of history. And so the main message here for us today is to be watchful, to be alert. We don't know when that time of Christ's arrival will come. And so day here, when he talks about day, refers to the day of judgment that we've heard about in the Old Testament. And so if we flip back to the book of Zechariah, chapter 12, beginning with verse 3, we'll see how this comes to play. It says, "On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples." Continue to verse 4. "On that day, says the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness." Then he continues on, verse 6. "On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood." And then verse 8, "On that day the Lord will put a shield about the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them shall be like David, the king. On that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem." God here working to protect Jerusalem. But in this passage 6 times, hearing that same quote, "on that day," speaking of that judgment that is to come. And this is in the prophet Zechariah, well before the time of Jesus. But here for St. Mark, that day can also refer to Jesus' passion and death. Earlier in Mark's Gospel in chapter 2, we won't look at it here, but he says that the day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, that we know that there's an alternative to that day of judgment, but also that day of Jesus' passion and death. Likewise, hour can also have 2 different but still altogether related meanings. That hour would be the time of the unexpected coming of the Son of Man, as described earlier in this same chapter. But that hour, also referring to that time of that coming of the Son of Man, can also refer to that hour of Jesus' suffering and that of his own disciples. Because in Mark chapter 14, the chapter to follow, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus fell to the ground and he prayed that if it were possible that hour might pass away from him, that hour might pass. And again in chapter 13, so before this passage, "When they lead you away and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but whatever will be given to you at that hour." So that hour of Jesus' suffering and the hour of his disciples' own suffering, referring to that in addition to that coming of the Son of Man. And so here we see that Mark has overlaid both near and far events to show how those are both related to each other. And so that passion of Jesus is really the beginning of the end of history. And so we see that that hour of Jesus' passion will lead to the future suffering of those who will follow him, of his disciples. In the same way, the end of that temple, the destruction of that temple and of that old covenant that was established, will eventually lead to the end of the world with time. And so that moment of the end of history, we know, is known only to the Father. And so if we return to this text that we read today, chapter 13, and go to verse 32, and he says, "Of that day or that hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." And so this is an ascending list. It doesn't mean us, and then it means the angels, Jesus, only the Father knows. So it's us, the angels, Jesus, and the Father. On that list, we have to go all the way to God the Father in heaven to find the one who knows when that end time will truly come. And so even Jesus in his humanity, even he had to live in obedient and in watchful faith, trusting in God the Father and trusting in his providence for him, even Christ himself when he was human here on earth. And so we continue with this passage. In verse 33, he tells us, "Be watchful." And that same warning, that same command to be watchful has been repeated 3 times before in this same discourse in this chapter 13 before this passage. And here Jesus adds, "Be alert," or "stay awake," which he also tells his disciples to do in the agony in the garden, which is to come. The disciples don't know when that time will come, and so therefore he tells them they should continue to live in watchfulness. And so Jesus didn't give them a particular timetable as to when this was all going to happen, because God doesn't want us to be calculating, but to be vigilant, to be keeping watch for him, to be faithful, to keep watch for him, not to calculate the date and time, but rather to always keep watch for his own coming. If we continue with this passage to look at the next few verses, Jesus compares this coming to a man traveling abroad when he places his servants in charge. And so this clearly points to Jesus and to his church. He had early in the gospel given them authority, and so that authority continues on with those disciples here today. And so now he speaks of his departure, when they will continue to exercise that same authority over that new community that he has founded in the church. And so this man traveling abroad has placed his servants in charge, each with his own work. And that's because each disciple had been given a unique service or a unique ministry to carry out within the church. This is much like our own stewardship commitment. We're each called to something different, but each of us, we know, is still called to some kind of ministry. And so that man who's traveling abroad, he also orders the gatekeeper to be on the watch. And so this gatekeeper finally refers to Peter, who had that greatest responsibility for vigilance. And as we see later, it's unfortunate, in that Garden of Gethsemane, we see he's not off to a very good start when he falls asleep, but that is for yet to come. And so to be on the watch, that order that Jesus gave, was also a duty of the prophets. And we see this from Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 17. So if we flip to that passage, Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 17. And in here, God commands that prophet, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me." And so those prophets too did not know when the Lord of the house, that man traveling abroad that Jesus spoke about in the parable, they didn't know when that Lord of the house, that true Lord of the universe, Christ the King, they didn't know when he would come. Lord here refers to Jesus as Lord over the temple of the Old Covenant, which he rejected, and also Lord of the church of the New Covenant that continues in the church as we know it today. So the prophets also had that duty to be on the watch, to continue to watch for much of history. And we continue that same duty, that same prophetic duty in our own lives here today. And so when Christ does come, he emphasizes again that it might be at literally any time. And here he mentions the 4 different Roman divisions of night: evening, midnight, cockcrow, and morning. Meaning it could be at any of these times of the night or of the day, but he mentions these 4. And so Christ here is saying it could literally be at any time. And here again, just as he did with the words a day and hour, Mark is also overlaying near and far events again to show how those are related. Because again, as we heard before, the passion of Jesus is really the beginning of the end of history. And so Mark divides that passion of Jesus using those same 4 Roman divisions of night. Because in Mark 14:17, when it was evening, he came with the 12, speaking of the Last Supper, that first Roman division of night, the evening there. And then as we continue on, we'll see in Mark chapter 14 again, verses 32 to 65, we're not going to read through all of this, but we see a few different events happen here. The agony in the garden, the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. Jesus comes before the Sanhedrin. So we know if those happened after the evening, but before he came to that Sanhedrin, that midnight was implied somewhere in there. That's the second Roman division of the night. And then as we continue on, again, chapter 14, verse 72, toward the end here, with Peter's denial of Jesus. Immediately the cock crowed a second time, that third Roman division of the night, that cock crow with Peter's own denial. And then finally, the very next verse, in the beginning of the next chapter, chapter 15, verse 1, and as soon as morning came, the chief priests took Jesus to Pilate, that fourth Roman division of the night. And so we see that evening, midnight, cock crow, and morning, that divided up Jesus' passion, which Mark gave much attention to. Again, trying to further just emphasize what Jesus had said just a little bit earlier, that his coming could come literally at any time, at any of those times. And so Jesus here finally ends this passage with another reminder to be vigilant, because he might come at any time. In verse 36, lest he come suddenly and find you sleeping. And so, again, as I said earlier, unfortunately, this didn't start off very well. Peter was literally found sleeping in the Garden of Gethsemane as Jesus was praying in 14:37. It says, when he returned, he found them asleep, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray. To be vigilant, constantly vigilant. He wasn't joking. He was being quite serious. To watch and to pray, to keep vigilant. And so to be asleep for us represents spiritual inactivity or laziness or self-indulgence. We see this in St. Paul in his letter to the Romans. First in chapter 11, verse 8. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor or of sleepiness, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear down to this very day. For him, that sleepiness is that spiritual stupor, not paying attention, that spiritual laziness. But to be awake, again for St. Paul, represents being alive in the faith. And here we flip to Romans chapter 13, verse 11. And he says, and do this because you know the time. It is the hour now for you to be awake from sleep. For our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. Showing that spiritual awakeness, that spiritual watchfulness is what is to be desired. To be awake represents being alive in that same faith. And so the trial that will begin in the agony in the garden in that next chapter, that will continue through the whole age of the church after Jesus as well. And so Jesus' followers are called to be constantly alert, to be constantly attentive to the presence of God in their own lives. So Christ ends his discourse, as I said, with that reminder one last time, which is clear for everybody. What I say to you, I say to all, watch, be alert, because we know, as true Christians and as Christian disciples, there is no room for complacency in the Christian life. Thank you.